Hello, everyone, and welcome. So good to see everyone, to have folks on. Welcome to this month's Bible Study Live, where we're going to be looking at a text from First Corinthians. And so get your Bibles, get ready. We're excited to be going through this text. But before we do that, I think we can go ahead and just introduce ourselves and maybe say our name, our pronouns, and how we're connected here at TMC. And so I can start. My name is Moses. I use the pronouns he, him, or they, them, and I'm the community program coordinator here at TMC. And let me pass it over to you, Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the communications and development coordinator here at TMC. And I'll pass it to Ellis.
Hi, I'm Ellis. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the summer intern here at TMC.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Well, as I said at the beginning, the text that we're going to be looking at today is First Corinthians chapter 13, verses 1 through 13. Pretty famous passage, pretty well used in a lot of places. You'll definitely recognize it. But this season, or this session, is kind of a continuation of last month's Bible Study Live, where we also talked about a piece from Corinthians. And so I wondered, Ellis, if we could pass it over to you just to give some context about what y'all talked about and kind of bring us into this Corinthians piece here.
Yeah, thank you. So like Moses mentioned, this is kind of a follow-up to last session where we talked about 1 Corinthians chapter 12. A lot of people seemed interested in going further with Corinthians and mentioned this passage, it's this particularly, so I thought we would continue with it. So yeah, just to bring you up to speed on some of the historical context of the letter to the Corinthians. So in this letter, Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and Corinth is kind of a big cosmopolitan city with a lot of ethnic diversity and class diversity. Like a lot of cities today, wealth disparities in Corinth were very visible during this time. And since Corinth was kind of a big diverse city, that appears in a lot of what Paul writes about. Now, in what we read previously last month, Paul is kind of talking about the body of the church and how the church needs diverse members for the whole body to flourish. And I think that as we think about Corinthians, we can really think about Paul encouraging very different kinds of people to learn how to be in community together. This letter really emphasizes personal relationships, conflict resolution, things like that. So again, in what we read last month, Paul is talking about the need for diversity in the body of the church. And what we are reading tonight gets a little more specific. Paul talks very particularly about love and how that shows up in the church community. So yeah, I think that brings us up to speed on where we are tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ellis. And that is some very helpful background. And so how we'll do this tonight is that we will kind of take it a few verses at a time, and we'll stop in between those verses just to share some thoughts and some questions. And please, if you have any thoughts or questions or comments, please feel free to put that in the chat. But I think what we'll start with is we will start by reading verses 1 through 3. And so I can read the first, I can read this first piece here. And I'll say, so I've been reading a couple different versions of this today. And I think I'm going to read the Message, which I really, I liked the translation of the Message for this chapter. And so this is from the Message, chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. If I speak with human eloquence and angelic ecstasy, but don't love, I'm nothing but the creaking of a rusty gate. If I speak God's word with power, revealing all his mysteries and making everything plain as day, and if I have faith that says to a mountain, jump, and it jumps, but I don't love, I'm nothing. If I give everything I own to the poor and even go to the stake to be burned as a martyr, but I don't love, I've gotten nowhere. So no matter what I say, what I believe, and what I do, I'm bankrupt without love. So yeah, the beginning of a pretty famous passage here, and I wonder if anyone has any initial thoughts or reactions at all.
It's always interesting to hear a really well-known passage in a slightly different translation than we're used to. I feel like that, especially like a more poetic translation like the Message, because it just allows a little bit, like kind of the typical way those words sound in our head to dislodge a little bit and for us to kind of maybe hear some different meanings in there. So I appreciate that you read from that, because like this is a passage that we've all heard so many times that it like kind of ceases to have meaning, at least in my experience. Like, so it was nice to kind of hear it rephrased.
Yeah, that's kind of how I felt, Peter, and I feel like I was like trying to look at different ways that the text was like kind of interpreted to understand it, and it was interesting too because I also was looking at the King James version, which I don't often read, but I know that it's probably closest to like what kind of the original language was. And what's really interesting is that in the King James version, every time they say love, it's actually translated as charity, which is, um, derived from the Greek word charis, which means grace. And I thought this was really interesting, especially because I think nowadays, I think the connotation that we have with charity is with philanthropy, and this kind of idea of like, um, yeah, just like giving charity for something or what that means. And I think that's just interesting because it feels actually kind of like what a departure of Paul is talking about here, and talking about kind of this initial understanding of charity or what love and what grace is, and how that has kind of been divorced from this and made to be something else. Which I can say more about later. But I wonder, Ellis, I wonder if anything's coming up for you here too.
Yeah, I think kind of similar to what Peter said, it's always really interesting to hear a translation that I don't usually read much myself. I think that the Message translation comes across very emphatic, very emotional in a way that feels probably truer to what Paul would have sounded like in his letters to churches. So yeah, I just think it's really interesting. You can really feel Paul's voice and maybe some of his frustrations bleeding through.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed in the Message translation that like stood out to me in a way that hadn't before was um where it said, if I have faith that says to a mountain jump and it jumps but I don't love, like that translation of that piece of the passage was like very different, because it, to me, it sort of emphasized love is not the same as control. Like, like faith to move mountains is just a phrase that sounds very sort of flowery and poetic um like unambiguously good thing, like, oh, I've got the power of faith. But you're telling a mountain to jump. It's sort of, you know the implication is that you're sort of trying to exert control through your faith, and love is like kind of set up in contrast to that. So I was just kind of interested by the fact that that stood out a little bit more in this translation.
Um, Ellis, I see you have some thoughts here, just I guess as it relates to kind of this idea of love and like the Christian church as a whole, and how that can be kind of hard to hold as Christian folks. And I wonder if you want to say a little bit about that here too.
Yeah, definitely. I think first off, I really just love that love is made the foundation of Christianity here. It's not any specific kind of doctrine or belief, it's love. That's the most important thing to Paul. And I think that can be something that's hard, at least for me, and I know for a lot of others, to kind of reckon with as we read into Christian theology and in Christian history and the history of the church, because the church a lot of times has acted in ways that haven't, I think, been indicative of love. The church has had a really active role in colonialism and historical events like the Inquisition, witch trials, chattel slavery, and even to today with attacks on immigrant rights, LGBTQ rights, and a lot of other people's rights. So it seems like a lot of the time, as the church has gotten bigger, as the church has become a dominant force, in so much of the world, the church acts out of a desire for power more so than love, and its actions really sometimes look a lot more like hate. And I think that returning to these verses, kind of returning to Paul's original vision of the church, is really beautiful through a liberation lens. All professions of Christian belief that we can make or talk about Jesus, Paul would say doesn't really mean anything if our actions aren't made out of love for those around us. So I think, yeah, just really tying that to justice work and thinking about ways the church has fallen short and the power that the church could have for justice movements now and in the future is really interesting to me.
Yeah, thanks, Ellis. That's so true and so beautiful too. And I think especially because I think part of what I was thinking of when I was reading this is I feel like there can be a great like misuse of saying like I don't know, I guess I was thinking of like uh Christian pastors in particular who say very hateful stuff and very like bigoted stuff, but shield it by being like it's out of love and it's out of like concern and it's out of like whatever, and then and just kind of like the weaponization of that, but then and so like thinking about that, but then also seeing the understanding of like love being as kind of like the foundation of the church and what we're supposed to like build on, like that's what is most important, like the true actual kind of deep love and not kind of this like misuse or kind of like bullying of it, that I feel like can be yeah, just used in that way. So thank you, Ellis.
Yeah, I think too with like some of the specific things that are being contrasted here, like even if I in the translation I was looking at, which was the NRSV updated edition, it says, "And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, but do not have love." And I was just thinking about like how often that seems to be a sort of like misalignment of priorities that the church has now, is like putting a lot of emphasis on being right, or like, having like the right theology or the right framework, or understanding all the mysteries, and if you don't understand it, then, it can't be true, or it can't be real. And that's set in contrast with what love is here. It's not about like kind of relying on your own understanding, but so it's it's interesting to see like how applicable these things are now when they were, like clearly we have a lot of the same issues. We still need this message.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Ellis, when you were like giving the context at the beginning, I was like, oh, that feels very, that feels very familiar. It feels like something we're still kind of wrestling with, for sure. Well, anything else on these first three verses at all, or anything from the chat at all?
Yeah, folks in the chat, feel free to chime in whenever you have thoughts about any of the things we're talking about. Oh yeah, I see a comment from Jamie here. Mm-hmm.
It's powerful. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Jamie. All right. Well, I wonder if we want to move to verses 4 through 7. I don't know, Peter, Ellis, if one of y'all want to take this one.
Yeah, I can jump in. So I'm reading verses 4 through 7 from the NRSV updated edition. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable. It keeps no record of wrongs. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things.
Thank you, Peter. I feel like I've heard that like a million times before. um, I wonder if there's any kind of initial thoughts about that, or just reactions to hearing that.
Yeah, I think for me, it kind of ties back to a question that we asked a little bit earlier, or just kind of a line of thinking that we had where sometimes Christians and pastors can really twist the concept of love. So they'll do some kind of injustice or enact some kind of hate and say that it's out of love. And I really like that Paul gives us a definition of love to work with here. So, yeah, love can't be hateful, not boastful, not irritable. Love is not insisting on its own way. I kind of see love in Paul's vision as a willingness to listen to other people and learn and grow and kind of decenter yourself in a way.
Yeah, thanks, Ellis. Yeah, I feel like the line basically, it keeps no records of wrongs. I do actually kind of think about that a lot, especially just in like I don't know, just like in thinking about like relationships where something can bother you or plague you for like a really long time, or keeping these things in, and the way that it can just add to this list or like feelings of stuff, and just thinking about how powerful it is to be like, actually, we're not going to do that. We're not going to hold stuff over people's heads. You're not going to have to feel like you'll have to like answer to something like, over and over again, or like something like that. And so I think from here, that is one thing that I actually think about quite a bit from this passage.
It's very hard to do. To like, I mean, I think all of these descriptions of love are, they're not meant to be easy. But I think that one is particularly hard, of like, how can we not keep a record of wrongdoing, while also like, making sure that justice is foundational and is done, and holding people accountable for their actions, like those things are important too. But to sort of allow healing to take place, to like allow that to be a possibility is important and difficult. Seeing Jamie in the chat reflecting on believes all things in response to the Me Too movement. Yeah, I can definitely see that as well. It being an important part of love.
Yeah, I think part of too, like, I think a lot of like this whole passage makes me think a lot of like Dr. King. And I have a few kind of Dr. King quotes in our note stock. And part of that is just because I think that he did such kind of some really like deep work about love and like what love means, and particularly this idea around like agape, which is basically just like this overflowing love, and it's not just love, it's also like love in action, and basically like trying to like do something with your love, and having love be something that helps you like fight or struggle for like other people too. And there's like in one unpublished speech, or in one speech from a Frogmore retreat, a retreat that he had with like a SCLC staff, there's a piece that I think about it a lot, where he talks about agape love. And one of the things he basically says is that like he's talking about the cross, and he's saying like, oh, what the cross reminds us of or helps us think of is like the length that someone will go to restore a broken community. And he talks about that a lot in relationship to love as like what does love mean in relationship to like what is love how is love going to help you be able to like go forth and restore and make right and do right by each other like these things in community and I feel like that is really moving to me because I feel like a lot of times what I associate this passage with is like at weddings which is fine obviously but also it's just like there's something also so much like deeper than that and expansive than that too and also something about like what does it mean to love is something beyond just like saying I love you or doing something like it's actually being a part of making kind of a system or society that people will be cared for and will be looked after for and so and I think also like Ellis and what you were sharing too in terms of like what some of the context of this community was like Paul was really trying to be like we need to love as like a community like this community kind of needs to like come be with one another and see one each other and really do right by each other um, and I see from Carolyn in the chat too I really appreciate Carter Hayward's poem that ends with to say I love you means let the revolution begin 1986 that's beautiful
I love that.
yeah
Yeah.
that's awesome.
Moses, I like the quote that you have in our doc too from Dr. King. Did you want to share that?
Yeah, I can read this. So this is from a Dr. King piece called An Experiment in Love. And it says, agape means understanding, redeeming goodwill for all men. It is an overflowing love which is purely spontaneous, unmotivated, groundless, and creative. It is not set in motion by any quality or function of its object. Agape is disinterested love. Agape does not begin by discriminating between worthy and unworthy people or any qualities people possess. It begins by loving others for their sakes, and it is entirely neighbor regarding concern for others, which discovers the neighbor in every man it meets. Therefore, agape makes no distinction between friends and enemy. It is directed towards both. If one loves an individual merely on an account of his friendliness, he loves him for the sake of benefits to be gained from the friendship rather than for the friend's own sake. Consequently, the best way to assure oneself that love is disinterested is to have love for the enemy neighbor whom you can expect no good in return, but only hostility and persecution. Agape is not weak, passive love. It is love in action. Agape is a willingness to go to any length to restore community. It is a willingness to forgive, not 7 times, but 70 times 7 to restore community. If I respond to hate with a reciprocal hate, I get nothing but intensify the cleavage and broken community. I can only close the gap in broken community by meeting hate with love. And so that's a quote. That's a quote that I think is really powerful, and also I think an idea that can be really misconstrued too. Of just like, oh, you just need to like love those who hate you, like blah blah blah. I don't think that's what Dr. King is saying. I think what he's saying is that like you actually need to go through work to like restore a broken community, and also just like the organizing and like what that takes to build that is not kind of a passive like he's saying it's not just a passive like love whatever but it's doing real work to try and understand what it means to really make right by community.
Yeah, I like the part in that quote. Agape does not begin by discriminating between worthy and unworthy people. I feel like that is, a sort of distinction that we see playing out at a lot of different levels in our society, but that we also are all sort of, prone to, and it's more difficult to see it in ourselves than it is to see it like in those sort of larger structures in society that are where it's really obvious. But like, the whole like, who is your neighbor? It's the person you're least hoping that I'll say, you know? Like I think it's always like a good exercise to be like, you know, if I really examine who do I think is like should really be my priority for love, and like how can I try to extend love beyond that person.
Yeah, I think that segues pretty well into some stuff I was thinking about when I read this. So, like, I think we've all mentioned so far, you hear this passage a lot at weddings. It's just kind of shown as like the epitome of romantic love. And I think romantic love can definitely be a part of what Paul is talking about here, but I think we're limiting ourselves a lot if we just look at this passage through the lens of romantic love. Because I mean, Paul himself never married, so clearly he's talking about a bigger love here, a love in the community that he participates in. And I think I really see love as this radical thing for him. It's extended to the whole community, to all different kinds of relationships that can be romantic, platonic, family, or community. I think, yeah, we just limit ourselves if we look at love as something that just happens in a romantic context between two people who are together for their whole life. And I think we can really just look at this passage as an ethics for relationships. For Paul specifically, it was for this church in Corinth he was writing about. But I think it applies a lot to being in community today too. And I really like the way it presents love as kind of like a sacrifice. Like we've said, it's a willingness to act outside of just our own interests and our own desires as we transform and restore relationships as they should be in our communities.
Yeah, thanks, Ellis. And that last piece too makes me think about like what Paul is also asking us to do is like kind of uncomfortable and kind of hard, but also like the process of transforming and like restoring relationships and communities can be like quite uncomfortable and like quite hard. And so yeah, and just like thinking about all the context of where this can be used in and for just makes me reflect on that. So thank you, Ellis.
Yeah, kind of like in contrast to that, I was noticing how that like verse 7 was making me a little bit uncomfortable. Um, I think the idea of like enduring all things, bearing all things within like a relationship is what love means. And I think that discomfort comes like for me from some personal experiences of being in relationships that were supposed to be loving, were supposed to represent love, and that were actually really harmful to me. And sort of staying in those relationships or staying in those communities longer than I should have because I was trying to bear and endure all things. But I think actually what you were saying, Ellis, actually helps reframe that a little bit because if it's not just about, especially if it's not just about like a romantic relationship, but it's really not about any one relationship. So it's not about, you know, just accepting, all like any kind of mistreatment from within any given relationship, but more about like the community as a whole and the sort of hope we have for restoration and healing, and the fact that we like don't give up on that, you know, like as a community and as a like the community of faith specifically.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. For sure. Yeah, I think um, it's just interesting to also see like how something so like profound and beautiful can also be so like deeply misused or like misunderstood in such big ways, or just like felt, But yeah, I appreciate for sure, Ellis, just like the reframing of what this means and like the expansiveness of what this means in our community and like as folks of faith as well. So thank you. Um, Anything else on these verses here, or anything from the chat either?
Oh, I just had one more quote that occurred to me that seemed applicable here, which is one of my favorites from Miriam Kaba, who's a like contemporary abolitionist thinker and organizer. And she always says hope is a discipline, which I've really like embraced a lot and come back to a lot in my life in recent years, of like hope being a practice, hope being something that is not a feeling or even necessarily like a belief system. It's more like a way of orienting yourself to the world, and that just connected back, I think, to like this part of the passage as well for me.
I love that. Yeah, all of this is like a discipline for sure. And it's also like you get it wrong. Sorry, I shouldn't. I should say I get it wrong. So many times, you know. Yeah. But you know, I guess the beauty of it is that you just have the grace to keep trying, and you have some kind of blueprint to kind of keep trying to head in the right direction.
Well, and especially if you're doing it in community, like it's not down to any one of us to like make it happen, you know. We're doing this project together.
Oh, I love this from Carolyn. I like hope as the planting of seeds for shade you'll never see. That's gorgeous. Beautiful. Well, I wonder we can take it to this next piece here. Ellis, would you be able to read verses 8 through 10 here?
Yeah, definitely. So this is verses 8 through 10. I'll be reading from the NRSV. Love never ends, but as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end.
Thank you, Ellis. Anything jumping out to folks in particular here?
Yeah, I guess something that kind of strikes me, and I think this is true for a lot of the books of the New Testament, but the end of the world feels very, not immediate, but like it's coming up very soon here. I think that a lot of the New Testament writers and Christian believers of the time really saw Jesus coming back as something that would happen within their lifetime in a tangible amount of time. So I think that kind of comes across a little bit in the tone here.
Yeah, Alice, that just makes me think of like how long ago this was written, and how much this kind of has endured through a lot of stuff, and how kind of love in these texts have kind of yeah, just like listed a lot of stuff, and is still kind of something that we're wrestling with too, of how to totally act this out as well. I feel like it's funny because I've always kind of felt like the first part of this for me, like this Corinthians piece for me, I'm like, get it totally 100%, like easy. But about when it gets to this part, I get a little tripped up. Like, and especially the next part, which we'll get to in a little bit. But like, I feel like this part, I find myself kind of like wrestling with a lot, and trying to understand totally like what to make of it. And I think, yeah, and I think like, uh, yeah, and I think just like, especially as someone who like doesn't feel like totally well versed in like the Bible or like stuff, I feel like there's some stuff around like prophecies or tongues or, you know, stuff like that that I don't really know what to make sense of, especially because and I and from what you're saying, Ellis, too, like I think that's some like helpful context as well. But I guess I like never like when he's like prophecies will come to an end. I'm like, what does he mean? Like tongues will cease. I'm like, I don't know what that means. Like, I mean, it makes me think of like speaking in tongues or something. But I also don't know if it's like something else. And then also like the last part too, for we only know in part and we only prophecy in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. I feel like in that I'm like, I don't know what he's saying. Um, and so I'll just put that up as transparency. And if anyone has thoughts too, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I kind of see the idea of the prophecies and the tongues coming to an end as kind of saying the church as an institution as we know it will come to an end at the end of the world. Like, we build up all these things, we build up all these doctrines and worship spaces, and then not that it doesn't matter in the end, but there'll be a time when that won't be anymore, like in the afterlife, after the apocalypse, whatever you believe about it. So yeah, I think just to me, it kind of feels like a call not to get too wrapped up in the earthly things or in our earthly ideas of what the church is, which I think can be kind of difficult to even think about in our human brains.
Yeah, I agree. This is definitely like a little difficult for our human brains. Um, I I think that like what you're saying makes a lot of sense, Ellis, and it's a hard balance to strike of like, you know, like not falling into the trap of like, well, nothing matters then. It doesn't matter what's true, or it doesn't matter, you know, how we practice, or, I think that's a tension that I deal with a lot in my life, at least, of like, you know, how can we still like stay in this sort of like search for the truth and search for understanding, like God and each other better, and also like be constantly aware of our limits in that, and the fact that like, we are not going to fully understand. We are not going to create a system that answers all the questions. um, and particularly not like kind of weaponizing that search for truth against others who are searching for truth, like, so that does seem like a tension that we always have to be wrestling with.
Yeah, and I think it makes me think too, and I put this a little bit in the notes of just like part of what I have am always kind of like wrestling with in terms of like my relationship to God, is how little I understand, and also like how things to me appear one way. But then when I have a little bit of like patience or something, um, I can see stuff in like a bigger picture. Or there's also just been like moments in my life where something seems uh, I didn't get something or something happens and I feel like it's the end of the world, and then something else happens. And I kind of am like, oh, I feel like I should have just like trusted God the whole time. And just this sense of being like, I can be connected to that or no. And I think the other thing that came up for me when reading this is like apart from kind of like the church, in some ways, what it felt like Paul was describing to me is also just what it feels like to get older too, in terms of like, and I think of elders in my life who, as they get older, they're what they had hoped would happen, or what they saw in their future might kind of become more limited as they understand the limited time that they have left. And then also just the ways that your body stops. As you get older, like sometimes you can't speak, sometimes you can't think right, like sometimes, all these human parts that like just happen, right? But what I've also seen, with elders that I work with, is seeing the way that like as that all ceases, the way still that like the love of community, or the love that people around them has been there to kind of bridge those gaps of what someone can't do anymore, or kind of have that love of what someone can't do anymore. And so, I know here that like Paul is kind of talking about this bigger thing in the church, but it also just made me think of like what it feels like to be human and to get older, and all these things that once felt like you had everything then cease, and what are you left with? What could you be left with? And also like how can we have a way where um, a society where it's built that folks can be cared for, kind of in that vulnerability too.
Yeah, it looks like Jamie was thinking along similar lines to you, Moses. Hope when I've laid down all else, I hope love will remain.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, I think, yeah, this passage, these verses in particular, can be kind of anxiety inducing in a way that the previous ones aren't. I think, like, especially as someone who engages with theology in a very, I guess, academic way, and working on my second master's degree related to theology, probably have a PhD in the future, hoping to work in either a seminary or a university. So I think I'm kind of, theology is an interesting field because it's like this quest for knowledge that you can never really have, I guess. It's about the process of questioning. And I think like there's a part of me that wants to know all the answers and to get all this insight about God and really, really feel like I know things and have things pinned down. But I think it's kind of not about that. It's about the process. It's about whether or not your theology is loving and what fruit it's bearing. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting passage to wrestle with for me, for sure.
Thanks, Alice. I love that description too of just theology of like, yeah, the study of something that we will never fully know. Yeah, and what that can bring us to for sure. Um, well, any other pieces on this part before we kind of go to the last couple verses? Cool. So then I can bring us home with verses 11 through 13. Um, and I'll read again from the message. When I was an infant at my mother's breast, I gurgled and cooed like any infant. When I grew up, I left those infant ways for good. We don't see things clearly. We're squinting in a fog, peering through a mist. But it won't be long before the weather clears and the sun shines bright. We'll see it all then, see it as clearly as God sees us, knowing Him directly as He knows us. But for right now, until that completeness, we have three things to do to lead us toward that consummation: trust steadily in God, hope unswervingly, love extravagantly. And the best of these three is love. Cool. Anything initially popping out of folks there?
It's really interesting to me that yours translated it as infant instead of child. I think that kind of just paints a really different picture for me instead of just saying child. Um, yeah, it's just more vivid. Like, I think infant kind of invokes this idea of like helplessness and needing someone to take care of you all the time in a way that just saying child doesn't.
I do like love extravagantly, and I'm wondering if that's just like a poetic flourish or whether there's something in the original language that like leads itself to that translation.
Yeah, Ellis, I actually have to say I was excited to be on this with you for this part because the first part, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. And when I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. I feel like I've always wrestled with that. But I remember when we looked at the Matthew piece a couple months back, you were just like sharing about some stuff that you had learned in like a class that was about like children and theology and stuff like that. And so I was like, I'm really excited to hear what Ellis has to say about this because of that kind of foundation. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that piece there.
Yeah, definitely. I think like from a child liberation theology perspective, there is a part of me that like bumps up against this passage in a way because I think like a really big insight that I took away from that children's theology class that I had last semester is to think of children as fully formed beings of their own right, not just to think of them as like partially formed adults, basically. And yeah, I think that, I don't know, like child has been defined so differently throughout history. So it's also kind of hard to construct a binary category out of it in the way that I think Paul is trying to. So I think for me, it's a little more helpful to kind of read this a little more metaphorically in a way, and also kind of to acknowledge that Paul's not necessarily describing himself as not childlike here. Like he kind of uses the metaphor of being a child and then growing up to talk about humanity in general. So humanity goes from like our life on earth, seeing only a reflection, as he says, and then someday seeing the truth or seeing God face to face. So, in a way, being human is kind of like being in a perpetual state of childhood, always engaging in this questioning and curiosity and not knowing. So, yeah, I think there is a very anti child way to read this passage, but there's also a very pro child way, a way of embracing the child likeness in our pursuit of theology.
Yeah, thanks, Ellis. I appreciate that, especially because as I'm reading this, I'm like, I don't know if I've ever put an end to my childish ways, but I want to. So I think that's helpful just to think too about, yeah, going through life in that way as well.
Well, and there are other, other scripture passages that talk about like what we can learn from children, you know, and like be like a child in, different ways of thinking about God and the world too.
I'm seeing one of the comments from Carolyn. Kind of imagined it as finding out your teachers don't live at school and the overall discovery of things. That's an awesome way to look at it. Thank you, Carolyn.
Well, and I think too one of the sort of characteristics of like gathering knowledge as a child is like when you discover something, you feel like you totally understand it. It's like, okay, I've gotten this figured out. This is the way things are. You go to school, that's where the teachers are, you know, and like there's some truth in that, but like we have to figure out how to remain porous and not get like, you know, stuck and realize that we're still learning, So I feel like that is maybe part of what's happening here too, is like, you know, just that sort of like humility that you eventually hopefully learn in adulthood of like there's always more to learn and discover.
Yeah, and how much as you grow older, you just realize that you don't really know anything, and that no one really knows anything. We're all just pretending. Um, well, we have about 5 minutes left, and so I wonder if there's anything on this piece, or if we maybe also just want to go and talk about some takeaways or questions that we might have from kind of this passage as a whole. Um, I don't know if someone would want to start.
Yeah, I think for me, the big takeaway from this is to just think about love specifically in an expansive way, to not narrow it down too much or to limit it. Because I think, yeah, like we've said, this is a really powerful liberatory passage that I think gets watered down a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that that felt like a really important sort of overall umbrella of what we were talking about. Is like, yeah, this is not love in these limited ways that sort of our society defines it, but like love in community, love in, you know, a wide range of relationships. And I also think, you know, for me, it keeps standing out like accepting our limited understanding and not prioritizing knowledge over love. That was really like coming through to me as a thread throughout as well, like which can be hard to do, you know. Um, but yeah, that sort of contrast and being aware of that was a big theme for me.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate um, just the ways this has helped me think about the love that Paul is calling for, and just the priority of that too. And I think part of what I'm taking away and thinking about is like um, this idea of like charity, and thinking about kind of where this comes out of. Yeah, how the kind of original translation is to charity and what that means, and kind of how charity has departed from maybe what it once was. And there was a another Dr. King quote that I was thinking of, where he just talks about kind of the limitations of that model. And so I'll just read. This is from his speech Beyond Vietnam. And he says, a true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play a good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth, and say, "This is not just." Um, and I think I just come back to that, because I think what Dr. King is talking about is kind of the limitations of what we have, and this idea of like philanthropic charity, and this kind of idea of just like just put a band-aid on everything or like whatever, and something. But what he's kind of actually calling to is like what actually like true love and charity and compassion means, is really wrestling for a very different kind of vision and way that our society is being built. And so I think I'm just reflecting on that and thinking about in all that we've talked to, just like the discipline and practice of love, and what that means, and like the uncomfortableness of that, the hardness of that, like kind of everything that goes with that. So any last thoughts at all? Last reflections?
I love that quote as a place to end.
Beautiful. Um, well, folks, thank you so much for joining tonight. We've appreciated getting to talk and learn with one another. Just a couple of announcements. Our next Bible Study Live will be on September 17th. And if you don't know, if you join us for support groups, please know that starting September 1st, and actually September 2nd, because September 1st is Labor Day, but support groups will move to our Circle community platform. And so if you're signed up for our support group email list, you can see the link of how to sign up there. But other than that, thank you all so much for coming on tonight, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your night. So thanks, y'all.